Hello again, everybody. This is episode 21, and today we're going to talk about the model of pure monopoly. So, in the last week, we talked about the idea of perfect competition. Competition that was so ultra competitive that we had lots and lots of firms producing identical products, where each individual firms, like Wheat Farmer Bob's, control over the price was zero. So, therefore, they faced a perfectly elastic demand. It was easy for new firms to come in and enter or exit. And that meant, of course, that in the long run, profits would obviously go to zero for any of the firms that remained. In the short run, profits could be positive or negative or whatever, but in the long run, they would be relentlessly forced to zero. Bob had to produce at the lowest possible cost, in the long run at the minimum efficient scale, if he was going to survive. He had to be a lean, mean, fighting machine, right? Darwinian in terms of survival of the fittest, quote unquote. On the other hand, today what we're going to look at in these episodes and this week is the story of the exact opposite end on the spectrum of market structures, and that's the model of pure monopoly. A situation where we've got one firm that controls the entire industry. And we're going to talk about those characteristics and the sources of that monopoly power in this episode. Talk a little bit about the ideas of profit maximization and how Mary's revenue situation differs from Bob's. Obviously, Bob was a price taker. Bob had to do whatever the market said was the price he could charge. He had no control over that. But Mary, of course, is a price setter or a price maker. And by controlling how much she produces, she controls the price she can charge. And that gives her a lot of power. So we'll look at how that looks in our model in this particular episode. In the next episode, the second episode this week, we'll actually do the profit maximization behavior, answering the three questions, maybe four, looking at the graphs and the math of that in simple ways to see what profits will look like for Mary in the short run and the long run. And in the last episode this week, we'll talk about two questions. The first question is monopoly good or bad for our society? Clearly, if you're a business owner, your goal is to get as far as you can to the right here, to have more power and control over your market. But generically speaking, from societal's perspective, right, society's perspective, societal's perspective, what was I doing? From society's perspective, we would like to have more competition, although that's not always the case. So we'll look at that idea of inefficiency, social inefficiency caused by monopoly versus competition, and then look at a case where actually monopoly is better than competition. We'll also talk about a practice that a lot of firms engage in. Bob can't do so, but the other firms can, and that's a practice called price discrimination. So we'll talk about that toward the end of the last episode this week. In this episode, again, we're just going to talk about the characteristics of pure monopoly and what gives monopolies power to control their markets. So again, if you look at the continuum graph, you see what it's got labeled, and our focus today is on our fictional monopolist by the name of Mary. Why Mary? Because it's alliterative, right? Mary the monopolist kind of rolls off your tongue and all that good sort of stuff. So the characteristics are in the chart on the next page. And so if you flip to page 2 here, you'll see the characteristic chart again of the four basic market structures. We actually talked about this last week and went through all of these pretty quickly. We talked a lot about perfect competition specifically last week. And we're going to go to the far right now this week and look at the model of monopoly. Just to refresh your memory again, in a pure monopoly situation, there is one firm and one firm only. They control the entire market. The product that they're producing is unique. It doesn't have any close substitutes. So, there's a situation where if Mary raises her price, people don't have other places they can go to get a substitute good that is close to the good we're looking at. So that gives her a lot of power over the price she sets. In fact, that's the next answer, which is that she has considerable control. Remember, she can't charge any price she wants, which is what a lot of people often say, because the story is she can only charge the price that's consistent with consumer demand. And so while that's higher than what Bob could do, she can't just say, hey, I'm going to charge, a gazillion dollars. If the demand's not there, people won't buy it. And so she's got a lot of control, but not perfect control. Importantly for number 4, she's got barriers to entry of competition. She's got something that can keep out other firms from coming into her industry. Maybe she's got patent rights. or she's got huge economies of scale that mean any small startup can never really get big enough to compete with her. Or maybe she has government sanction or government blessings on her monopoly where she doesn't have to compete. Or maybe she controls a strategic resource, etc. And we're going to look at those sources of monopoly power here very, very shortly. In terms of non-price competition, advertising, branding, location, marketing, and all that stuff, she's not going to do much of that, right? Just for goodwill or to get her name out there. But beyond that, why should she really advertise to say she's better than her competition? Because she doesn't have any competition, at least at this time. We talked about some examples, right, last time, and we're going to do that again. But the Milwaukee Brewers, for example, have a monopoly on professional baseball in the state of Wisconsin. The story is that your local water company, water and sewer treatment company, is a government-run monopoly locally. Your electric utility company, MG&E or Alliant or whatever your company is, they're usually, at least in this part of the country and most states in the country, the only provider in their particular defined service region. So there are examples of pure monopoly. And what do they do in terms of profits? Well, they take money off the table until there's no more money to take off the table. Now, they're probably going to be able to take more total money off the table than Bob is in the short run and maybe even in the long run. But the story is they still follow that rule of MR equals MC, or the last unit where MR is just greater than MC as the profit maximizing level of output. In terms of the demand curve, we're going to see in a second that for Bob, the demand was perfectly elastic, but for Mary, it's not. Mary's going to actually face the downward sloping market demand curve because she's the only player. And her demand curve is going to be pretty darn inelastic, pretty darn steep. So that if she raises her price, it's not going to lose many sales because there aren't many good substitutes, right? There aren't a lot of places people can, if any places, people can flee if they don't want to buy her product. So she'll lose some demand because people won't be able to afford it, or they'll say it's something I don't absolutely positively need. But the story is she's going to have a lot of control over price and revenue. And then we'll look at the rest of this on the bottom of the chart later. And again, it'll be a good review when you come back and compare all of the different market structures. So let's turn to the next page and focus specifically on the idea of what are the sources of monopoly power. Now, when I say monopoly power, another term we as economists oftentimes use is we call it market power. And that means the ability to limit competition. And so really, both of these structures, oligopoly and pure monopoly, have considerable monopoly power, ability to keep out competition. It's perfect here, there's no competition. Here it's not perfect, but they still have the ability to stop a lot of new firms from coming in and taking a piece of the pie. There's only a tiny, tiny bit of it here for Luigi, and there's no market power at all for Wheat Farmer Bob. So what are those sources of monopoly power? There's a bunch of them. And some firms have several of these simultaneously, so they're not mutually exclusive terms. The first one that allows businesses sometimes to keep out competition is that they control patents. And so when they control patents or copyrights, that kind of thing, what we call it is patent monopoly power. And there are lots of examples you can think of, right? One that's in the news all the time has to do with microcomputer chips, right, and processing for computers. There's been battles for the last many years between two of the big players, Intel and AMD. And both of them are continually putting patents up there for new chip designs for computers to try to protect themselves from competitors replicating their chip design. A patent, there's different types of patents, drug patents and other sorts of patents, but typically a patent, if it gets approved by the U.S. Patent Office, is good for 20 years retroactive to the date you applied for that patent. So what that means is that you've got protection under the law, right? If somebody comes and tries to develop a product or an idea or a process that's too close to your idea that was patented, then you have the right to take them to court and sue them for patent infringement. And so obviously that gives you a lot of protection to keep out competition and create a monopoly power barrier to entry of new firms. So in that particular situation, we've got patent monopoly power. There's lots of those all over the place. Those patents aren't always perfect because people can come up with similar but not identical ideas and still compete, but they do give you some control in your market. One interesting thing to note, of course, is that people take these ideas and they take them to their extremes. So one of the growth areas, in a negative way, around this country and other countries is the development of patent trolls. And some of you may have heard of this, but patent trolls are folks that develop patents, develop these ideas, get them approved by the U.S. Patent Office with actually no intention ever of actually designing or developing or selling the product or the process or the idea. All they're trying to do is get their name on that patent, and then they look out for people or firms or businesses who violate that patent, and then they sue them for a living. So that's all they do, right? Is they go fishing for patent violations where they take them to court and make a killing. So a lot of that's going on in this country and around the world, and that is maybe rational for those individuals, but it's an underside that's not too pretty when it comes to that monopoly power and the use of patents. So that's one source of monopoly power. A second source of control in a market to keep out competition is when you control a strategic input. And when a business controls a key input that other folks need, right, other producers or consumers need, and it's an input that nobody else really has, or very few firms have, you have a lot of control, obviously. And that leads to a strategic resource monopoly, or strategic resource monopoly power. And there's different examples here you can think of. Obviously, in the oil industry, right, there's a few really, really big drillers that control a lot of the market for that. That's actually going to be oligopoly. But because so many people need oil and its derivatives like gasoline and all the rest, those firms have considerable strategic resource monopoly power. You could think about, you know, the nickel industry. International Nickel Company up in Canada controls a significant percent of the deposits of nickel in the world, and so they've got considerable control over the price of that commodity, nickel. Another interesting one that's always fascinating is in the diamond industry. And for years and years and years, there was a cartel by the name of, and we'll talk about cartels in a little bit, but an industry, a group by the name of De Beers. And De Beers Diamond Cartel, for many, many years, controlled a wide percent, a huge percent of the total sources of high-quality diamonds in this world. And the way they got that power is an intriguing story indeed, right? Through lots of manipulation, lots of killings, lots of stories of intrigue and all of that. So it's a pretty shady business, to say the least. But let me ask you a question here real quick. And there is competition now for De Beers. It's particularly in lower quality diamonds from other countries that are sort of undermining some of their power. But the story is that you know, De Beers controls a significant part still of the diamond industry. So let me ask you a question. Are diamonds rare? Are they scarce? And I hope you said no. Diamonds are rocks that the De Beers cartel, for example, has warehouses full of them, right? Stockpiles of them, and tons of them. But because they control the supply of that, right, the production of most of that, they decide how many they're going to let out to the public. And so what they would do, and they still do this to some extent, was that De Beers would bring diamond buyers from all over the world to their warehouses, particularly in London, but some other places as well. And they would come and have those people come in, and the De Beers representatives would come out with diamonds and say, here's what we have, here's the price, take it or leave it. And they had to take it, right? If they were going to have the diamonds they needed to make their jewelry or for other industrial purposes or what have you. De Beers controlled the supply. And so they had a ton of influence. So number one, they control the supply. And then the other thing that makes diamonds so expensive historically is you all know this, right? Especially you guys out there, and the ladies know the story too, that they've marketed through the years that you don't really love her, right? The girl you're going to give the diamond to, unless you spend at least 3 months of your salary, huh? Otherwise, it's not true love. Got to be at least 3 months, right? Or it's not true love. And they've convinced guys and women through the years that that's kind of the story. So they've increased the demand by changing those preferences, those whatever, and shifted that demand curve to the right along those lines. That's why I actually asked my wife to marry me when I was in graduate school. I didn't have any money, so 3 times my limited amount of money wasn't too expensive. How many? Economist. I don't know how she puts up with me, right? But don't tell her I said But anyway, the story is that De Beers is an interesting story. Plus, of course, this has all the issues with respect to blood diamonds and all the stuff that's going on and has been going on in Africa for a number of years now. The story that people will get those diamonds, sell them on the market, use the money to buy guns to fight civil wars in Sierra Leone and other West African, particular West African nations. And so the old story is that you gave your sweetheart a rock, and that rock has blood on it. They have tried to reduce that that story through some number of processes, including the Kimberley process, but the story is that that's not been perfectly successful because it's hard to control and identify and verify that whole supply of diamonds that they're not covered with blood. Anyway, so if you control a strategic input or a strategic resource, that gives strategic resource monopoly power. So we've got two so far, patent monopoly power and strategic resource monopoly power. A third power comes from the government, and that's called a government monopoly. The key here is that this is actually the government running the business. They're the only provider. The government actually does the provision themselves. It's not a privately owned company. It's the government collecting taxes and using those resources to provide a service without any competition. So I'm sure you can think of some examples here, like your local water and sewer company, right? Those are run by your municipality. And there's no competition for that, right? We need to have clean water and all of that, and the government is the only provider. It could be done in a private market, but it's not in almost all cities, at least in the United States, and a lot of other countries for that matter. A second example might be things like, snow removal on the public roads, or it might be the story of road repair, fixing all the potholes. There are going to be a lot of them, right? There's a lot of them every spring and all of that. So the story is that would be another good example of a government monopoly. The government is the monopoly, okay? So then you get government monopoly power. A similar one to that, although this is where we have privately owned firms where the government says you don't have to compete. They grant them legal monopoly status, leads to, as it says for letter D there, a legal monopoly. So these are privately owned companies. That's key, right? So if you want to, you go up there where it says D, private firms or privately owned firms, and circle that or mark it. These are private, for-profit businesses, but the government grants them the right to not have to compete. They grant them monopoly status. So examples here would be things like your electric utility company, MG&E or Alliant are great examples of legal, monopolies. They're private companies, right? But the government says you don't have to compete. And I'll tell you why they do that in just a second, but that's what we call a legal monopoly. Another example might be in your particular area, there's one private garbage collection firm that's been given the contract by your municipality, your city, your township, or whatever. And so that particular company is the only provider of that service. Or for a long time, Charter Cable TV. Anybody booing out there? Well, they're getting better, I guess. The story was for a long time, Charter Cable TV had a legal monopoly in the provision of cable television. Now AT&T U-verse, at least, is a competitor. And of course, there are other competitors in terms of, satellites and all of that. But the story is for a long time, in terms of cable television, they had the legal monopoly. They, came in and said, we're going to provide this, and the city, agreed to that contract, and therefore they didn't have to compete with anybody. Now, why would businesses or governments, grant those legal monopoly powers? Why would they say a firm doesn't have to compete? Well, there's a couple of different reasons, but the primary reason actually relates to letter E. And that is that some monopolies exist simply because they have huge economies of scale. Now, you might remember us talking about economies of scale a few weeks ago when we chatted about the idea that economies of scale mean as you get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, you're able to spread your huge startup costs, your overhead, your fixed costs, over more and more and more and more units, so that on average your cost per unit just keeps on going down and down and down and down and down as you get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. So you're more cost efficient, cost effective as you get huge. And what that means, of course, is that if you are allowed to get huge and produce at that low cost, then new firms that are starting up can never really compete with you because they can't get big enough fast enough to be able to take advantage of those economies of scale. So, if you think about an example here, if you want to write one down again, it would again be like your electric utilities, MG&E and Alliant are great examples of natural monopolies. The story there is that if you think about what it takes to start up an electric utility company, all the capital outlay in order to build the generation capacity and the transmission capacity and all of the rest of that stuff for an electric utility grid with all the right? Millions and millions and millions and millions and millions of dollars to get something like that up and going. So what that means is that if that company can be allowed to get huge, they can spread that overhead, right, the startup costs over more and more units, and get to the point where they can provide electricity per kilowatt hour much cheaper than a small firm that still has the same startup costs but can never get big enough to spread it out, right? And so what happens there is that it's natural, that's why it's called a natural monopoly. It's natural to have one firm that's really big, and then the government steps in and says, we'll let you get really big. We won't make you compete. But the story is that in exchange for that, we're going to regulate your prices. Because if the natural monopoly, right, was allowed to do it on their own, they would choose to produce less and charge a really high price because that would be profit maximizing. Their goal is not to minimize cost. Their goal is to maximize profits and do that by producing less and charging more. But the story is that the government says, we don't want that, right? We want everybody to have access to cheap electricity at an affordable price. We're going to let you get huge, but then we're going to regulate your prices when you do that. And if you want to get a rate hike, well, you can get a rate hike if you get it approved by us. You have to go before the government board, like the Public Service Commission or the Citizens Utility Board or whatever it is in a particular region, and actually open up your books and say, this is why we need this rate hike, and you must justify that. And so that means they just can't raise prices willy-nilly without going through some oversight by external auditors. Now, the problem with that is that those government agents, those people on the Public Service Commission or whatever, may be subject to bribes, under the table payments and all that kind of stuff, or doing a favor for somebody, and in return they're going to get something favorable for their constituencies or for them individually. And that is a problem with the political principal agent problem story. But having said that, at least overall, it tends to keep electricity affordable, available to the vast majority of people. Some states have tried to go away from that model in some areas to do a deregulation of the electric utility markets and say, hey, let's just have it a free-for-all, right? Competition kind of story. Not quite there, but over here. And most of those situations have met with smashing failure. So, for example, a few years ago, down in out in California, they deregulated electric utility and said, hey, let's just have firms compete with each other. The problem was that a bunch of small firms started to come in and tried to compete, and everybody found that they could not get big enough because they were splitting up the pie instead of having the whole pie. They could never get big enough to spread their overhead, their startup costs, and so electric utility rates went up. Several of the businesses failed, which meant that those customers of those companies had a disruption in their service. There were rolling blackouts and all kinds of other headaches that we don't really care for when it comes to having access to basic need like electricity. And so in this case, it may be natural and better. In fact, usually it is better to have one firm rather than competition, in the case of the natural monopoly. And I got one more here, and then we'll move on to the last little bit for this section. And that is that we also have power, monopoly power, that keeps out competition when you have what are called network economies. That leads to a network monopoly. And let me just get real here in terms of some examples, because I think this will all make sense. One great example would be Facebook. So if you're jotting examples down here, Facebook would be a good one. Or historically, Microsoft would be a good one as well. Or maybe the iPhone, or what have you. And here's what I mean by that. Let's talk about Facebook. How many of you use Facebook? Lots of you, right? Most of you, maybe all of you. And the story, I do too, right? I don't really care for it, but I use it to send birthday greetings. Hey, to my high school friends and college friends and family and whatever it is. Hey, how's it going? Because if you don't hear from them. So anyway, so I use it that way. But that's kind of the point, is that, is Facebook the very best possible social networking site that you could imagine? Does it do everything the best you could possibly imagine in terms of sharing data, in terms of communicating, and all the rest? No, there are some features of that particular site that are really annoying. right? And you have different ones, I'm sure, and I have ones that I don't care for. But we use it, right? Why do we use it? Yep, because everybody else uses it, right? So Facebook was not the first player in the game, but they were the first player in the game of social networking that really got it together in a way that there was a big critical mass of people that adopted it. And when that happened, I know MySpace was there and a couple others, but they really found a way to attract that critical mass. And then once that mass started to happen, everybody else said, well, my friends are using it, so I better use it too, otherwise I'm going to lose out. So they developed the network. They got in first in some sense. They play the best in some sense. And so the story is that even though they're not the greatest in so many ways, they gained the power. Microsoft's the same way, right? For years and years and years now, Windows, and it's still a big player, obviously, in the game, but Windows was the operating system. And people swore at Windows and the Microsoft suites and all that kind of stuff day after day after day, but they kept on using it because everybody else was using it. And so if we wanted to be connected and communicate, we had to use that particular product. There's some erosion of that now, of course, in terms of browsers with Firefox and other things. There's some erosion of that when it comes to the Mac and the alternative platforms. But the story is that there's still some network monopoly power associated with that particular good. So all of the sources of monopoly power create barriers to entry. And if you look at the 6 of them, think about examples that will help you think about why firms over here might be able to keep out competition. There are a couple of notes underneath, and I see that I have note number 1 as a 3, note number 2 as a 3, and the questions above as 3. So the numbering's wrong on this page, sorry about that. But if you note, the barriers to entry are seldom complete. They seldom keep out all competition, and the story is that indeed beyond that, they seldom last forever. So if a monopoly relies on that monopoly power and they don't innovate and try to keep controlling their market, coming up with new things, sooner or later new firms will take away some of that power. So you can't afford to get big, fat, and ugly, if you will. As a monopolist, you have to also kind of be on the edge as to what's the new stuff, the latest and greatest, to maintain that monopoly control over your market. Okay? And like I said, the last note just says there's barriers to entry that are big time in these 2 industries, oligopoly and pure monopoly. And they're only tiny here for Luigi. He doesn't have much, right? He's a restaurateur, and in the Italian restaurant industry, he doesn't have patents or he doesn't have big economies of scale or other things that keep out competition. But in these 2 industries, they are enormous. And what they mean, of course, is in the long run, those firms may be able to, it's not guaranteed, but they may be able to make a huge, huge profit. Okay? All right. So what does profit maximization look like for Mary? Before we do that, let me tell you a joke, right? There was this gentleman who was invited to a Halloween party, a costume party, by his friend. And the guy was thinking about what am I going to use as my costume and all of that. And so anyway, he came up with an idea, and he went to the house of the host of the costume party, and he rang the doorbell. And the host answered the door, and he looked at the guy, and he said, what's going on? Because the guy was standing there, and all he had was this girl hanging onto his back. And the host said, didn't you get the memo? It's a costume party. And the man said, well, I am in costume. And the host said, you just got a girl on your back. I don't get it. What's your costume? And the dude said, well, I'm a turtle. And the host said, you're a turtle? What do you mean? And the man said, yeah, that's Michelle. No? All right. Sorry about that one. I kind of like that joke. Anyway, so how does a pure monopolist like Mary go about profit maximizing? You know what? She answers 3, maybe 4 questions, the exact same questions that Bob answered, right? How much output to produce, what price to charge, what are profits, and if they're negative, then should I shut down or keep operating? So it's the same questions, the same approach, the same basic answers, and so that's important. Her cost curves look just like they did for Bob, because those are based on productivity, and that doesn't vary across structures. What is different is the revenue side of the picture, right? Because you remember that Mary is not a price taker, she's a price maker. She's a price setter. By controlling the output, she picks the price she can charge. And so let's look at a numeric example here of the revenues of a monopolist. Let me quickly just put this table up here, it won't take long. So we've got output, price, total revenue, and marginal revenue. And then we've got output ranging from 0 to 6. And price here would be 8. At that price, they wouldn't sell any. $7, they'd sell 1, 6, 5, 4, 3, and 2. And of course, I have to take this marginal revenue for the first unit since it's undefined and give it a blank like that. So then the question is just to fill in this table first, and then we'll answer some questions underneath. So the first thing to do is calculate total revenue. And you'll all recall that total revenue is just price times quantity, right? So the first and second columns multiply. So if you don't sell any units at $8, you don't have any revenue. If you sell one unit at $7, you have $7 of revenue. 2 at 6 apiece is $12 of revenue. 3 at 5 apiece is 15. 4 at 4 is 16. 5 at 3 is 15. And 6 times 2, $12 of revenue if you sell 6 units at $2 a piece. Then what's the marginal revenue? Well, marginal means additional. I know you all know that. So it's the change in total revenue when you sell one more unit. So the change in total revenue over the change in output. And so when the firm goes from 0 to 1, when Mary does that, her revenue increases from 0 to 7. So she's got $7 of additional revenue by selling the first unit. If she sells the second unit, right, one up to 2, her revenue goes up by $5 from 7 to 12. The third unit adds $3 of revenue to her total. The fourth unit adds $1. The fifth unit actually means her revenue goes down by $1, so negative $1. And if she produced the sixth one, she'd actually lose $3 in revenue. This is not the type of situation that was faced by wheat farmer Bob, right? This is very, very different indeed. Now, this isn't on your note set, but the next answer will be, and that is that if you looked at these first two columns, right? These first two columns reflect the demand that is faced by Mary. And if we plotted that out, right, it's not perfectly elastic. In fact, the story is if we plot that, and I'm not going to get all the numbers here, but just the general shape, what you would see is that as the price, in order to sell more, right, she has to lower the price. So her demand curve, which is her price line, is downward sloping. Why? She's the market. She's the only provider of that particular product, and so she faces the entire market demand curve. Then the second question on the bottom here, so we filled in the table, that was the first question. But the second question is, what's the relationship between price and marginal revenue? What was it for Bob? Price and marginal revenue were equal. Because if Bob wanted to sell one more unit, he sold it for the price he had sold the previous unit for, right? And his revenue therefore went up by the price he got for that last unit. So price equaled marginal revenue for Bob. That's not the case for Mary, right? You look at it, here's the story. For the first unit, the price is 7 and marginal revenue is 7. So they're equal at the first unit. But then for the second unit, Mary has to lower her price to 6 for both of the units, and her revenue only goes up by 5. So price is greater than, right, marginal revenue. Same thing for the third unit. She gets $5 for price, but her revenue only goes up by 3, etc., etc. What the heck is happening here? Right? Let's write it down on your notes first. Except for the first unit, this is question 2, price is greater than marginal revenue for a monopolist, right? Price is greater than marginal revenue except for the first unit. Okay. Why is that? Well, the reason that is because I'm assuming that Mary cannot price discriminate. And what I mean by that is that she cannot go and charge different prices for the different units of the good. In other words, if she sells 2 units, she must sell each of them at $6. She can't sell the first one at 7 and the second one at 6. She's got to charge $6 for each of the 2. She cannot price discriminate. If she sells 3 units, she must sell each of them for 5. Not the first one for 7 and the second one for 6 and the third one for 5. She must sell all 3 of them at $5 a piece. So what that tells me is, let's go back to she's selling 1 at 7. If she wants to sell a second unit, she can sell each of them for 6. So she gets $6 from that second unit. But what happens in terms of her total revenue? Well, she loses $1 from the first unit. She can't sell it at 7. She's got to sell it at 6. So she gains 6 from the second, but she loses $1 from the first. So her total revenue only goes up by 6 minus 1, or $5. Right? Or how about this one? Instead of selling 2 at 6 apiece, she sells 3 at $5 a piece. What's her marginal revenue? Well, the third unit brings in $5, so that's extra revenue. But she had to lower the price by $1 on each of the previous 2. So she lost $1 for each of those. So she gains 5 and she loses 2. She gains a total of 3, right, in terms of her revenue. You could keep on going down and see what is happening in terms of that. Okay? So price is greater than marginal revenue except for the first unit when it comes to a monopolist who's not perfectly price discriminating. Okay, so let's graph that, and that's actually on the top of the next page. And what I want you to do now is, in the space provided here, draw a demand curve that is downward sloping, and label it D equals P, D equals price. Okay? Then what's the marginal revenue going to look like? Right? Well, the marginal revenue we know is less than the demand, except for the less than the price, less than the demand, except for the first unit. So what that tells me is that the marginal revenue curve looks like this. Right? If you plotted this out, you would see that the marginal revenue curve is everywhere except at the first unit below the demand curve. And in fact, importantly here, marginal revenue will actually go negative, as we saw in this particular example. Also, numerically, just to give you some sense, we are going to use this a little bit later, if the demand curve is linear, it's a straight line, then the marginal revenue is twice as steep, 2 times the steepness of a linear demand. Right? So it's twice as steep, and what that means is that it's going to cut the x-axis here half the way to where the demand curve cuts it. It's going to get there twice as fast, and so we have that particular relationship. What do you note here? Right? Well, there's several notes. The first note says, you know, the demand curve is the market demand because the monopolist is the only provider. This is not a perfectly elastic demand. It is somewhat inelastic, right? That's what note number 3 says. It's rather steep because the monopolist doesn't have any close substitutes at all. Doesn't have really any substitutes for their product. So if they raise their price, they don't lose much in terms of volume of sales. The second note says that Mary's a price setter. What do I mean by that? Well, here's what I mean by that, right? If Mary decides to produce 5 units, she sets the price she charges at $3. But if she decides to restrict supply to 3 units, she picks a price of $5. If she produces only 1, she picks a price of $7. She sets the price by choosing the level of output that she is going to produce. And we'll talk about what the level will be to maximize her profits in just a second. Okay? So you can also see my explanation there in words of the fact that she is not engaging in price discrimination at this time. Okay? So this is the key distinction from what we did last week with Bob. In monopoly, we have a situation where Mary is a price setter, and therefore her marginal revenue is not going to be equal to her price. It's going to be less than her price, except at the first unit, and the graph is going to look like this. Everything else is going to look the same. The cost curves, short run, you know, average and marginal cost curves, and the long run average and marginal cost curves are going to look exactly the same as they did for Bob, but the revenue is different. So that's the end of this episode. In the next episode, we'll put both of those together, the supply or the cost and the revenue pictures, and talk about profit maximization. We'll do a numeric example. We'll do a bunch of graphs and look at short run and long run possibilities. So until then, we'll see you soon. Thanks.